Welcome to your first World History podcast. Today's podcast is going to start off with lecture notes unit 1.6 on John Locke and his Enlightenment ideas as a philosopher of the Enlightenment. Once we're done with the unit 1.6 podcast, we'll be jumping into the next podcast, which is unit 1.7 on Enlightenment philosopher Charles Montesquieu. A reminder that by the end of both podcasts, students will be able to recall Locke's and Montesquieu's Enlightenment ideas and argue if those ideas have created any change in the world that continues today by completing an exit ticket with 80% accuracy. For this podcast, we're going to start off first with some Marginalia Notes on John Locke. As we're going through these Marginalia Notes, you'll see various terms bolded in yellow. These are the terms that you should be filling in the blanks for in your lecture notes for today. All right, so John Locke was an Enlightenment philosopher whose ideas are used today in many different democratic documents. If you don't remember what the Enlightenment was this time period during the 1700s in which lots of different philosophers, lots of different thinkers were coming up with a ton of democratic ideas, meaning ideas that gave people power, that gave people rights, that gave people freedoms. Last class during lecture, we talked about Enlightenment philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft and about her democratic Enlightenment ideas, which were focused primarily on women. Today's Enlightenment ideas from John Locke and from Charles Montesquieu, we're going to find focus mostly on men and the democratic rights and freedoms that these Enlightenment thinkers wanted men to have. Many of John Locke's Enlightenment ideas can be found in his book titled Of Civil Government, and we're going to be focusing on 4 of these specific Enlightenment ideas by Locke. The first Enlightenment idea he had was that man was made by God, and that since man was made by God, he had been made in God's image. Now, being that you were made by God, and being that you were made in God's image, Locke believed that man was sacred, meaning man was special. If God had made you and you were basically a replica of God, this made you a special being, a special animal. The second idea that we find in Locke's book of Civil Government is that man has natural rights he is born with, meaning ways that he expects and deserves to be treated. Locke called these natural rights, these expectations of treatment, he called them natural rights because he believed that all men were naturally born with these. So, for example, just like a fish is born with scales, a dog with fur, and a bird with feathers, Locke believed that men at birth naturally were born with these rights, with these freedoms and expectations for treatment. Locke believed that it was the government's only job to protect these rights, meaning that governments existed to protect these natural freedoms, rights, and liberties that men had been born with. So what are these natural rights? Well, Locke believed that men had the natural right to life, to live a free and happy life. He also believed that men had the right to liberty, to live a free life made up of their own choices and actions. And finally, that men also had the right to own property, make decisions on their property, and to do with their property as they please. Now, again, throughout this entire slide, we've really focused on the word men and he, meaning that our buddy over here, John Locke, made all of these Enlightenment ideas focused on men and men only. So young boys and women were excluded from these Enlightenment ideas. Today, we don't call these natural rights life, liberty, and property. We don't call these natural rights today. Now we call them human rights because we believe that all of these freedoms to life, liberty, and property belong to all humans. I'd like you to circle this section right here. I'd like you to circle this, and I'd like you to write that the idea of life, liberty, and property is a democratic idea that we have borrowed from Locke today. However, it's important to notice that where Locke gave all of these rights and freedoms to men, today in our society, we call these human rights because we believe that they belong to all humans. For the next section of our podcast, you're going to be focusing on answering these 4 video questions. For these 4 video questions, you can find the link for the video embedded inside the podcast's description details section. Go ahead and pause the podcast, read through the video questions 1, 2, 3, and 4, then copy and paste the link for the video, watch the video, and answer the video questions. Alright, so now that you've had a chance to watch the video, let's go ahead and check your answers. If you were not able to answer all questions, or if some of your answers to these questions were incorrect, please go ahead and pause the video now in order to check your answers and make any needed corrections. Once you're done, you can go ahead and continue the rest of the podcast. Alright, so now that we have a good detailed look on John Locke's idea of natural rights and how natural rights are known as human rights today, let's go ahead and take a look at the next idea that John Locke had. John Locke believed that there was a social contract, meaning a deal that men had made with the government. He believed that in this deal, in this social contract, men let the government have power and agree to follow its rules. So for example, an example of the social contract today would be a DUI checkpoint. When we allow the government to set up a DUI checkpoint, we have pretty much made an agreement with the government. And this agreement with the government is that we are giving them the power to stop individuals at certain checkpoints. And when these individuals are stopped at certain checkpoints, we agree that if we are one of them, we will willingly get out of the car, willingly take a breathalyzer test, and or willingly allow our car to be inspected. That is part of the social contract we make with the government. We're giving them the power to set up these checkpoints, and we are also giving in and being obedient to their request. We are going to follow their rules. Now, the social contract comes at a price. The government is supposed to use this power and this obedience that we promise them. They're supposed to use this power and obedience to protect men's natural rights from being taken away. So, when we give the government the right to set up a DUI checkpoint, and when we agree to follow their rules, we are doing this because we acknowledge that the government, the police in this example, is going to use their policing power to protect our natural rights. Our natural rights in this example is the natural right to life. By increasing DUI checkpoints and by following a police officer's request at a DUI checkpoint, the idea is that the government should be able to increase our chances of living by reducing the likelihood of drunk driving. Let's take a look at another one of John Locke's ideas that is used today. If the government is not doing its job of protecting men's natural rights, meaning that if it's being corrupt, men can break the social contract. So, we made this deal with the government. We allow the government to create DUI checkpoints and we agree to follow the rules at the DUI checkpoints. But if the government or police officers are being dictators and are abusing their power, then according to John Locke, we the people have the right to break this contract. And when we break this contract, we no longer have to follow their rules and we can actually get together to revolt, meaning to overthrow or to challenge the government's power. Now, sometimes these revolts can be violent and sometimes they can be peaceful. But when the people do decide to revolt, pretty much the people will get together and the people will get rid of the support system that they're giving the government. And when we get rid of this support system that we've given to the government falls. The government can fall because they've been fired. The government can fall because they've been killed. The government can fall because they've been put into prison. So, the contract is broken when men try or do overthrow the government via a revolt. The idea, consent of the governed, supports breaking the social contract. And this is a perfect example here of consent of the governed. If you don't know consent of the governed, you want to go back to your Enlightenment Notes, Unit 1.4. Consent means permission. In this case, the permission is this board right here. and the governed is the people. Now, the people give the government permission to exist because we agree, according to the social contract, we agree to stand on this plank of support in order to keep the government in power. But when the government acts like a dictator and the people decide to break this agreement of obedience, then the people can walk away from this plank of support. And when they walk away from this plank of support, the government falls because the government no longer has the support of the people. This idea of social contract, this idea of consent of the governed, the idea of natural rights, the idea that man is sacred and special, all of these are Enlightenment ideas by John Locke, and these Enlightenment ideas can be found in various democratic documents and within various Western, meaning advanced nations today. Go ahead and pause the video in order to take a deeper look at how the social contract works. Again, the social contract is an idea that unites the people with their leader. We can see what the people need to give the government and what the government has to do in return. And we can see what happens when the government doesn't follow their part of the contract and how the people can react to the government being abusive. Go ahead and pause this video to take a quicker look at this part of the lecture. All right, now that you've taken a deeper look at the social contract, you're going to be answering the next two video questions, question 5 and 6 for video number 2 on the Arab Spring. The link for this video can also be found in the podcast's description section. Go ahead and pause the podcast, read questions 5 and 6, copy and paste the YouTube link, and then watch the video in order to answer these two questions. All right, so now that you've watched the video, let's go ahead and clarify some information that might have been confusing. You learned about Muhammad Bazi, a street fruit vendor who lived in the city, within a city in Tunisia. Tunisia is a country within northern Africa. And you learned that he was very upset at how his government was treating him and other people in Tunisia. And so he decided to start a revolution by basically killing himself and kind of making a big statement. Now, when he killed himself, he created such anger within the rest of North Africa that all of the other people in these North African countries who also were living under dictatorships, they decided to unite and revolt against their dictators. And that revolution eventually trickled in over to other countries in the Middle East who also decided to revolt. When all of the people within North Africa and all of the people within the Middle East revolted, this was known as the Arab Spring, a revolution in which people all around these different countries were tired of their dictators' abusive power and decided to revolt and demand democracy. Go ahead and pause the video in order to check your answers for questions 5 and 6. Go ahead and add any missing information or make any corrections to your answers, and then jump back into the podcast. All right. We're going to go ahead and jump into the last section of today's podcast. We should be on the Unit 1.6 notes. Here's a reminder of our objective. Here's some directions on how you're going to be completing the next section of the notes, which is to read this primary source here in purple. While you're reading this primary source, you are going to be conducting a C.U.B.S strategy. If you've forgotten how to conduct C.U.B.S, you're going to be checking the bookmark here in the right-hand side, which reminds you that you're circling unknown words and defining them, underlining main ideas, summarizing what you learned from the document, and then boxing evidence for your summary. Here are some definitions I thought might trip you up, so when you are doing your circling for the C.U.B.S, you can go ahead and use the definitions here. And here are the expectations for the activity. We're completing this at a level 0, raising our hand for teacher help, and then getting a stamp for completion once we're done with the entire John Locke activity. This activity for reading the source should take you no more than 12 minutes, and once you're done, you can jump into the second podcast for Montesquieu.